Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Pronk. I was formerly a doctor in the Australian Army and served for 14 years in total, discharging in 2014. And what I want to talk about in this video is that period of transition, that period when I came out of the Army and tried to reintegrate as a civilian. And this is a period of time that I found particularly challenging, but I know that many others really struggle through this period as I did as well. And what I want to explore is just some of the reasons why this is the case. And it was certainly something that I hadn't considered deeply, if at all, when I was planning my discharge from the military. And it was things that I really didn't see coming, to be perfectly frank, and really caught up with me quite quickly after I took the uniform off for the final time in 2014 and started to try and negotiate that transition. And when I look at everything that had happened up to that point and that 14 years that I spent in service, I can start to see why, for me and for many like me, it's a really unsettling time to transition out of service, be it military or in a first responder role, police, corrections, ambulance service, fire brigade, any of these roles where you are part of a high performance team, part of a tight knit group, but also doing somewhat unique roles and having unique exposures and potentially uniquely traumatic exposures that can really serve to bond groups together and make it difficult to transition out of that group. So looking back on my training pipeline, I joined the Army on a scholarship to study medicine. So fundamentally, for the first 4 years of my military service, I went to university like any other civilian. So it wasn't really, whilst I was full-time Army on the books, I was studying like anyone else doing a medical degree. Then for 2 years after that, similar story. I was full-time Army, but I was doing my junior years as a doctor to become fully qualified. But all of that while I had started to build this identity as a member of the Army. I was one on the books. I hadn't put that uniform on and turned up to my first posted unit as yet, but I was starting to think of myself as military. I knew that my trajectory was heading towards the military. During that period of time, I had started to get some exposure as to what the role was going to be like as a doctor with the Army, and more so through my brother, I had got some idea of what Army Special Operations looked like, and I'd set myself the goal of hopefully serving with Army Special Operations. So once I'd finished my medical schooling, my junior doctor years, I then posted into my first Army unit and really started that military indoctrination. So I was already starting to identify as military. I was excited by the prospect of getting into my first unit, doing my military specific training, which took about the first 12 months of my time in uniform. And then I was looking forward to the opportunity to use my medical skills in that military environment. And so during that first year of military training, went away and did my courses, the abbreviated officer training that you get as a medical officer. But all of these courses allowed me to start to put the uniform on, to learn to operate the weapons systems, to learn that application of my medical skills in a military environment. And when I look back now, it was really that period of time where I started to get this visceral feeling of being a member of the military. I was posted to a unit, I was wearing uniform day in, day out, I was going to work on Army bases, I was going to courses in military training institutions, and I was around others who were starting to form this tribal sense of bond. And we see this fairly strongly in organizations like military and first response, this communal training pipeline, often this shared suffering, this through your training exposures, your shared kind of knowledge of skills and development of skills, and this feeling of identity. And then superimposed on this is this feeling of purpose. I felt this really strong sensation of purpose. I was starting to come together with this military tribe. I felt like a member of that in-group, so I was one of them, and we all started to formulate this strong identity, and it was all sort of molded by this purpose of the military, which at that point the Australian Army was quite active in places like East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so there was this wartime footing that held this purpose and this potential for deployment, and what I saw at that time as the application of my skill sets in these environments that had a lot of meaning, had a lot of purpose, and were going to be the ultimate test of my skills. And we see this in any first responder community, that training pipeline, that coming together as a tribe, that sense of identity and that sense of purpose. And these are really, really positive and powerful things that happen in these communities. They bond these teams together. But what's happening in the background there is you are becoming part of an in-group. And by virtue of that, there must be out-groups. And when I look back now, I can see that during that indoctrination and induction into the military world and the army world, I became part of these in-groups that then divided me from a social psychological perspective from the out-groups of civilians. And now that's a positive thing. It gives you that identity and that esprit de corps and that sense of bonding and that tribal sense of community, which we get in groups like military first responders. But with hindsight, what was happening was this divide between me as having a military identity and my former civilian identity. But as I said, at that point, it's necessary and it's useful and it's positive to see yourself, as I saw myself, as part of that military tribe. And then as my career progressed and I further solidified that military identity and had the opportunity to start to deploy at first with a regular army unit to East Timor, and so to get overseas and see what that looked like in the deployed environment, to continue to build my skills, and then to move for me what in the direction that I wanted to head to special operations. That was this refinement of this identity and this refinement of this tribal sense of identity with the then Special Operations tribe. And so for the last 5 years of my military service, that was my in-group, Army Special Operations. I was deploying to Afghanistan. I went 4 times in the end to Afghanistan as part of the Special Operations Task Group, and had these amazing experiences, these really high highs, the satisfaction and the professional reward of doing the job at what I considered to be the level that I wanted to be at with that task group, and then the low lows that came with that, where we would have task group members injured or even killed on operations. And all of that was further strengthening that sense of identity. There was that overarching sense of purpose, and that purpose being contributing to something that I saw was significantly bigger than myself, this investment in the country of Afghanistan that I felt we were contributing to, and I felt on a small level I was a piece of that puzzle contributing to that higher purpose, further strengthening my identity. Those shared experiences of highs and lows was further strengthening that in-group sensation of being viscerally attached to this task group of soldiers that we were deploying with. But with hindsight, that was further and further dividing me from these out-groups, the civilian out-groups and other out-groups. And so while it was very positive and served to really strengthen my resilience, allow me and all of us to continue to function in these high-stress, high-consequence environments, what I can see now is it was setting me up for a really challenging transition back to civilian life. So when it came time for me to transition, I'd finished my 14 years, the last 5 of which with special operations, deploying to Afghanistan on 4 occasions, and I made the conscious decision to discharge. So I was fortunate enough to be leaving the army on my own terms. I wasn't being forced out through an injury, be that physical or mental health or any other reason. Then it was the right time for me to discharge. I had a young family at home and I was spending big chunks of time away. My third son had just been born, and for a variety of reasons, it was the right time, I felt, to transition out of the army. So I had a good period of time, about 6 months, from when I made the decision to discharge until when I took that uniform off for the last time. So had the chance to plan, and I could only see the positives at that stage. I could only see that I would be home with my family more than ever, that the pace of life and the stress of life would significantly reduce when I discharged, that the risk of my role would significantly reduce when I discharged. As a doctor, I had really good career prospects. I was lucky enough to have a qualification that translated well into civilian life, which isn't always the case with other military or first responders transitioning from their line of work. And so there was all these positives. We were moving back to my wife's hometown, so we'd have some great support network around us, her support network. We'd have grandparents living locally to help out with the kids, and I was going to be able to earn a good income as a civilian doctor. And so when I transitioned, I only saw this as a positive move. And then indeed for the first maybe 3 to 6 months after transition, it all did go well. I was reintegrating, everything was new. We were setting up in a new house and getting the kids set up. I had some leave to clear, so I didn't have to rush into paid work. And when I look back now, I didn't really feel that I had discharged, to be honest. It felt like a period of protracted leave, that I just was this honeymoon period, if you like, when I got out. But at about that 6-month mark, the reality of that transition started to set in. I started to do my first civilian doctor jobs and started to try and rebuild a civilian community. And it was at that stage that I really started to struggle with the process. The reality started to sink in that I was no longer a part of that in-group. I was no longer part of that tribe. I'd lost that sense of identity and that sense of purpose. And I still, at my core, identified as being a member of that in-group, that group that I had spent 14 years moving towards, that identity that I'd spent that 14 years formulating. That was who I saw myself as being, a member of that military group. And yet here I was, no longer part of that group, so dislocated from my tribe, removed from both a professional perspective, but also geographically. I'd moved away from these people, so I wasn't even seeing these people who I'd spent so much time with over that period of time, wasn't even seeing them socially, so I was very isolated and felt this profound sense of loneliness. And it wasn't that I didn't have people around me, it was just that I couldn't relate to the people around me. And it was a very unsettling and disruptive time for me socially. Professionally, when I started to go into roles as a civilian doctor, I found them very unstimulating. And that's not per se because the roles were unstimulating, it was just relative to the pace of my previous role in the military. They didn't have the same intensity. I didn't have the same sense of purpose. And on top of that, I just couldn't relate at that point with the people I was working with. And when I look back, I can see that was that cultural divide, that social identity theory, as it's called. I saw myself as a member of that military in-group. For 14 years of my life, the civilian population had been an out-group, and then in the blink of an eye, I'd transitioned out of the military and was, by definition, a civilian again, and trying to find my way in what I had been seeing as an out-group. And so I think once I started to frame it like this, it started to make sense why not only I was struggling with this process, but why many transitioning military members, police, ambulance service, firefighters, correctional officers, the list goes on, why you struggle in transition. It makes good social, psychological sense. When I started to think deeply on this, I started to frame it around the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or Maslow's triangle. I found to be a very useful reference point to start to think in my mind as to what had happened here and why I was struggling, despite the fact that on paper, my life looked a lot better in a lot of ways. I was home more than ever. I was with my family more than ever. I was earning more money than ever. And yet, from a psychological perspective, I was worse off than ever at that point. I was highly anxious. I was hypervigilant. I was starting to have flashbacks from traumatic events that I'd experienced in the military, bad dreams, all of these things that I recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress were happening at a time where I was never safer, and on paper things looked a lot better. But when I looked at how that was affected with regards to Maslow's hierarchy, we can see that when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the optimal point of Maslow's hierarchy is what he refers to as self-actualization, or being the best form of yourself that you can be. And when I reflect on this, I saw myself as that when I was a member of the Army, and particularly a member of Army Special Operations. I'd completed those basic levels. I had my safety and security needs looked after, a stable income that allowed me to have good housing and feed my family and put clothes on our backs. So the basic needs were well met by the income of the role. But then moving up to those higher levels, the psychological needs, this was where I was really fulfilled primarily by my work role. So I did have my family, my wife and my kids at home, fulfilling that psychological aspect of those needs. But when it came to my esteem needs and my feelings of prestige and my feelings of self-confidence and those close relationships, that was all being fulfilled by my work role. And that was leading to this opportunity for me to self-actualize, to feel like the best version of myself as a human being, to feel like I was doing what I was put on this planet to do. When I look back with hindsight, that was all linked to being in the Army. And the second I took that uniform off and discharged from the military, that was all stripped away. And this, when I started to look at it through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy, it began to make sense while I was struggling. I still had my basic needs met. I was earning good money as a civilian doctor. Thankfully, I still had my family unit intact, and so I had that intimate relationship with my wife, and my kids was still there, but I'd lost the remainder of those psychological levels of Maslow's hierarchy, and I'd lost my sensation of being self-actualized, because that was all linked to the job. And I've had this discussion many times with many transitioning people from the military or from first responder roles, and that Maslow's hierarchy is something that really seems to resonate. It certainly made sense to me, and as soon as I began to realize that that's what had happened, I also became aware that was how I needed to start framing my roadmap back towards a good version of myself. I needed to start rebuilding these upper layers of Maslow's hierarchy. The other thing that occurred to me at this point was just how long it had taken for me to formulate my identity as a doctor with the Army. So I think when a lot of us, myself included, transition from something like military or first response role, we anticipate that transition process and finding our feet as a civilian or outside of the first responder community is going to be a quick one. We think that it'll be measured in maybe weeks to months. And then I think a lot of people get a bit unsettled when you find yourself struggling for months to years after you transition, and sort of caught in between these two worlds. You're no longer part of that in-group of the military or the first responder community, but you're not yet identifying as part of the in-group as a civilian or whatever role you go into outside of military or first response, and you're caught in between. And when we look at that from the perspective of how long it took to really truly build that identity as a military or a first responder, in my instance, that was 14 years. I know a lot of people serve for decades longer than that. If you start to think of it from that perspective, it's taken you that period of time to formulate and then reinforce and strengthen your identity with those communities. we really can't expect us to find our feet and become the best version of ourselves outside of those communities in a short period of time. And so I think it's useful to consider that, to consider it will take months and even years to really start to rebuild an identity and a purpose, and to move towards a new sense of tribe, and to move towards a new sense of self-actualization once you've transitioned. And I think this is something that certainly I misunderstood and misinterpreted, just how long that would take. And I think this is where a lot of transitioning military and first responders that I interact with also find themselves in that process that's taking months to years, and you can get a bit lost in that space. There can be this feeling of actual grief. You're grieving your former self. You're grieving your former identity. You don't know who you are. You can't go back, you can't move forward, and you're sort of stuck in between. And I think this is a dark space that a lot of transitioning members find themselves, and then it can lead to some maladaptive behaviours, and alcohol's a common one that we see to try and just cope with what's going on and try and negotiate this space. And certainly alcohol is a coping mechanism, but it's not an adaptive one. It's not a positive one. And what I'm hoping to achieve in this video is just to shed a bit of light on this space in between and some of the positive things you can be doing. There is a way forward. I found the way forward. It was clunky, it was slow, it was a struggle, it had its ups and downs. But if you can just see that roadmap, if you can look at it through that lens of Maslow's hierarchy, see where you need to invest and rebuild and find a new identity, find a new purpose, find a new tribe. It's not easy, it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. It's going to take years and years to find that. But once you can see that pathway forward and focus some energies towards these positive factors of tribe, of identity, of self-esteem, of accomplishment, of self-actualization, that, in my opinion, is the way you need to negotiate this transition. And there's certainly plenty of support out there to help in this process. And when we look at the support you can get as you negotiate that, one of the key groups certainly is your previous in-group, so those previous tribe members, if you like. But that can be a difficult one to negotiate because you are no longer, by definition, you are no longer part of that in-group. But they're the people that get you, they understand you, they have that visceral sense of connection. And so there's some support you can absolutely get from your former tribe members. But equally as important, you need to be moving towards forming new relationships and forming a new tribe outside of your own role. That's the only real way to move forward and start to rebuild those top layers of Maslow's hierarchy, is to start forming new in-groups. It doesn't mean you have to cut ties with the old ones, but if you stay too ingrained with the old groups, it can really hinder your ability to move forward and formulate that new identity. And everyone negotiates this differently, but just having some awareness of that connection with the old in-group, I think, is useful, and investing some energy into generating new in-groups and a new identity and tribe is very important. The next group that's really important to lean on for support during transition is your family members and your friends outside of your former role in the military or first responder organisation. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with these relationships is the fact that they won't be able to viscerally relate to what you have experienced during your service or what you're feeling during transition, and you shouldn't expect them to, and you shouldn't hold them accountable for not being able to truly empathize. The power of these relationships is hopefully you can lean on these friends and family members to be your vulnerable and authentic self, to be you, and to be able to tap into that support and share your feelings about what you're experiencing, but not expecting them to be able to empathize and understand, just to be there to support you as you go through your transition. And then the final group that I think is really important in this space are the psychologists and the other healthcare professionals. Now, I certainly appreciate that in roles like military, policing, corrections, the list goes on, paramedics, firefighters, these cultures are often quite stoic in nature and, in my experience, don't often tap into their psychological support very well at all. There's a degree of, unfortunately, stigma that's still associated with seeing the psych in some of these organisations, but I think more than that, people in these roles see themselves as being the stoics, the ones that provide the help and don't ask for the help. And so we tend to not seek psychological support while we're in service. But that period of transition, if you haven't already, is the time to absolutely plug in with psychological support. Now, the key that they can offer is the evidence-based techniques to be able to negotiate that transition process and to be able to start making sense of some of the experiences and exposures, the traumas, the critical incidents that you might have had along the way and not ever taken the time to revisit and process. For me, I found that my period of transition was the time that a lot of my previous exposures caught up with me. And I think the factors that we've just spoken about relating to that loss of identity, that loss of purpose, that loss of tribe, all left me vulnerable with this decreased resilience, left me vulnerable to all this unprocessed experiences from my service. And so that was the time when it really caught up with me. Even if you find you're going okay from that perspective, just the simple stress of transitioning, well, not simple, the profound stress of transitioning out of the military or a first responder organisation, that loss of identity, that grieving of your former self, and that transition piece trying to integrate back into society, back as a civilian, into a new work role, building a new tribe, is an incredibly stressful period, whether or not you've suffered traumas from your period of service. And so this is where psychologists can help. And they'll have the strategies and the tools that you're not going to get from your former tribe members, and you're often not going to get from your family or friends. So this is the time, if you haven't previously, to be tapping into psychological support, to be tapping into the healthcare networks that exist to support transitioning members, and because they are a powerful ally to have in your corner. And so somewhere between the support of your former tribe, for that empathy, your family and friends, for that vulnerable interpersonal relationship, and then the psychologists and other healthcare providers for that professional guidance and those evidence-based strategies to help you negotiate that transition, you can get a rounded support while you work your way through that process of transitioning, rebuilding your identity, rebuilding your sense of tribe, and rebuilding your self-actualized identity outside of your military or first responder role. At Aussie Frontline, we exist to optimise our military, veteran and first responder communities. I hope you've got something out of this video. If there's anyone in your community that you feel might benefit from the content, please do share it widely. If you do find this of interest and you want to take a bit of a deeper dive into some of these concepts or other concepts that relate to military and first response communities, get across to our website and check out our blog content there for more information. If you are a member who's approaching transition or who has recently transitioned and you want to take a deeper dive into the concepts that we've covered in this video, then we have a Thriving in Transition online course available, in which there's about 2.5 hours of content that really drills down into the detail of all of the social psychological theories that we've discussed lightly in this video, but also a bunch of tips and strategies to be able to negotiate that transition piece and help you thrive throughout transition, help you build a new identity, a new purpose, a new sense of tribe, and to be able to self-actualize after transition out of military or the first response community.